Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. While there aren't going to be as many blockbuster movies opening this year as compared with last year, which is probably a very good thing, since most of the ones that were released last year ended up being huge flops, one of the upcoming blockbuster movies that is opening this year includes one of my all-time favorite characters, Deadpool, aka Wade Wilson. And that movie is aptly named Deadpool and Wolverine, and it stars Ryan Reynolds, who is reprising the role of Deadpool, as well as Hugh Jackman, who will be reprising his role of Wolverine, aka Logan, which he hasn't portrayed since the movie entitled Logan was released back in 2017, which was 7 years ago. But while this is going to be the third Deadpool movie, it will be the first new one since 2018, which was 6 years ago, and it's the first one to come under the control of Marvel Studios and Disney, making it an MCU movie for the very first time. And as an MCU movie, it will be the very first to feature X-Men characters. But before proceeding, I'd like to ask everyone to please like this video, please share the video on social media, please subscribe to support this channel, and please press the bell to receive notifications. Thanks! Now, the last MCU movie to be released in theaters was last year's female-centric movie, The Marvels, which has the dubious distinction of being the lowest-grossing movie both domestically and worldwide for the entire MCU and its 33 movies that have been released to date, and which I have talked about in multiple videos that I released last year. The Marvels was also one of the biggest flops of 2023. With a reported production budget of $274.8 million, when multiplied by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively, to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget, yielded an estimated break-even point range for the movie of $687 million to $824.4 million. The Marvels holds the record for the MCU for having the lowest domestic opening weekend box office of only $46.1 million, and is the only MCU movie to ever not earn at least $50 million during its opening weekend. It also holds the record for being the MCU's lowest grossing movie domestically by only earning $84.5 million for its entire domestic theatrical run, and it's the only MCU movie that failed to earn at least $100 million at the domestic box office. The second lowest grossing movie domestically for the entire MCU is 2008's The Incredible Hulk, which only earned $134.8 million domestically without taking inflation into account. And finally, The Marvels holds the record as being the MCU's lowest grossing movie worldwide by only earning a pathetic $206.1 million, and the only other MCU movie that couldn't break $300 million globally was 2008's The Incredible Hulk, which earned $265.6 million without taking inflation into account. But things are definitely going to be radically different with Deadpool and Wolverine when it opens in theaters next month, because two different websites are predicting a truly fantastic domestic opening weekend box office for the movie. And the website that I typically rely on, Box Office Pro, recently predicted that the domestic opening weekend box office for Deadpool and Wolverine should be on the order of $175 million to $200 million, which is a completely reasonable range when you compare it against the average domestic opening weekend box office for all 33 MCU movies and the standard deviation. And that overall average is $132.6 million, with a corresponding standard deviation of $69.3 million. Thus, one standard deviation above the MCU average domestic opening weekend box office is $202 million, meaning that Box Office Pro's predicted domestic opening weekend box office range of $175 million to $200 million is within one standard deviation of the MCU's overall average opening weekend box office. So it's not an unusual or unbelievable predicted range. And the movie has a reported $250 million production budget, which, when multiplied by 2.5 and 3.0, means we get an estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. And a very reasonable question is whether the movie will be able to break even or not. To answer that, I'll project what the movie's possible final domestic and global gross box office earnings might be. Given that Deadpool and Wolverine is an MCU movie, I'll use historic MCU box office data to calculate my projections for the movie. So to project what the movie's final domestic box office might be, I need a range of possible average weekly drops, which I can statistically derive from the past 33 MCU movies, whose overall average weekly drop is 38.19%, with a standard deviation of 6.45%. Using those values, that gives me a range of possible average weekly drops for the movie that are one standard deviation above and below the MCU's overall average, which is a range from 31.74% to 44.65%. And given how wide that range is for the possible average weekly drops, rather than use the full range of predicted opening weekend box office from $175 million to $200 million, I'll only use its mid-range value of $187.5 million to keep the projections from diverging too much. And when I do that, I can project that the final domestic box office for Deadpool and Wolverine may be on the order of $420 million on the low end, $490.8 million at the mid-range, and $590.1 million at the upper end. And that would be an incredible final domestic box office for the movie, since the mid-range value is 0.72 standard deviations above the franchise's average final domestic box office value of $355.7 million. Now, to project what the movie's final global gross box office earnings might be, I'll initially only use the MCU's overall average domestic share of 41.41%. And when I do that, I can project that the movie's final global gross box office revenue may range from $1,014 million at the low end, $1,185 million at the mid-range, and $1,423 million at the upper end, which strongly suggests that the movie has a very high probability of breaking $1 billion at the global box office. But since we don't yet know what the movie's final domestic share is going to be, I'll also use a range of possible domestic shares that are plus or minus one standard deviation from the average, which gives us a range from 34.42% to 48.41%. And using that range, it extends the previous range that I listed from a low of $867.6 million to a high of $1,714 million. And what's very interesting with that extended range is that even if the movie's final global gross box office earnings end up being closer to $867.6 million, that's still well above the movie's estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. So based on the movie's current predicted domestic opening weekend box office and the projections I made that are based on past MCU movie performance, I am very confident that Deadpool and Wolverine will have no difficulty breaking even, and there's also a good chance that it could break $1 billion at the worldwide box office. People like Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman, as well as their characters of Deadpool and Wolverine, but far fewer like any of the characters that were in the previous MCU movie of the Marvels, and given the rather unique circumstances behind the production of Deadpool and Wolverine, I don't see this as an overall turnaround for the MCU. Instead, it's probably just going to be a very positive one-off, because none of the other upcoming MCU movies that won't start to premiere until 2025 or possibly later sound anywhere near as good. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.